Tonight, on Fear Knocks, 10 true Appalachian Trail night runs after dark horror stories. The ridges are wet and the air feels charged. Long-distance runners call this the blackout stretch. No cell ping, no signal bounce. Just breath and gravel in the beam. Trail signs reflect at the wrong angle, and mile markers seem to move between passes. Shelter logs lose names overnight. Repeater traffic loops a clip distress call every 20 minutes. In the gaps, truck cams disagree on the hour, while the same siren crosses two counties that never heard it. It's autumn on the line. Fog in hollows, frost on rails, and steps that sound too close behind. Subscribe and hit the bell. We drop new true horror stories every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time. Your words keep this archive alive. After dark. I was a night runner, training on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. The air was crisp, just after midnight in late autumn. I noticed the milepost number seemed off by a significant margin. My routine involved long-distance runs, often through the night, covering segments of the trail between designated gaps. This particular stretch was familiar, a challenging ascent leading to a ridge saddle before a long descent. I carried minimal gear, a hydration vest, a headlamp, a small first aid kit, and a satellite messenger. My phone was primarily for GPS tracking and emergency calls, usually kept on airplane mode to conserve battery. The isolation of the forest at night was a constant companion, a deep quiet broken only by my breathing and the crunch of gravel under my trail shoes. I had been running these routes for years, logging hundreds of miles, and I knew the terrain intimately. Every turn, every climb, every painted blaze on the trees felt like a part of my own memory. The cold was manageable, a sharp bite that kept me focused and moving. I relied on my internal clock and the occasional glance at my GPS watch. But mostly, I ran by feel. This was a segment I had run dozens of times, always starting from the same trailhead, always aiming for the same distant highway crossing. I had started my run from a small parking area near a gap trailhead, just as the last light faded from the sky. The initial miles were uneventful, a steady rhythm through the darkening forest. My headlamp cut a bright tunnel through the absolute blackness, illuminating the path ahead. The air grew colder as I gained elevation, and a thin frost began to form on the leaves beside the trail. I was making good time, feeling strong, pushing towards the ridge. The trail here was well maintained, marked by white blazes on trees and occasional wooden posts indicating mileage or junctions. I had passed the last known shelter a few miles back, its dark outline barely visible through the trees. My plan was to reach a specific milepost, turn around, and head back to my vehicle. This was a standard training loop, one I had completed many times without incident. The hum of distant highway traffic, usually a faint presence, was entirely absent tonight, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to absorb all sound. I reached what I expected to be the turnaround point, a small clearing where the trail flattened briefly before another climb. My GPS watch indicated I had covered about 12 miles. I looked for the familiar milepost, a weathered wooden marker with a number painted on its face. I found it, but the number was wrong. It read, Mile 10. My internal calculations, confirmed by my watch, placed me closer to Mile 12. I stopped, my breath pluming in the cold air. This was not a minor discrepancy. A 2-mile difference on a marked trail was significant. I checked my GPS again, cross-referencing it with the preloaded trail map. The map showed my current position precisely where mile 12 should be. The painted number on the post was clearly 10. I walked around the post, examining it under the beam of my headlamp. The paint looked fresh, almost too fresh for a trail marker that had been there for years. There were no other markings, no signs of vandalism or alteration. The post itself seemed firmly set in the ground. I felt a prickle of unease. My mind searched for a logical explanation. Had I misread it? Was it a new post, replacing an older one with an incorrect number? I decided to document it. I pulled out my phone, switched off airplane mode, and took a photograph of the milepost, making sure the number was clearly visible. The cold wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the surrounding forest. I shivered, not just from the temperature. I decided to run back a short distance, perhaps a mile, to see if I had somehow missed another marker or taken a wrong turn, though that seemed impossible on this well-defined path. I ran for about 10 minutes, covering what felt like a mile, then turned around again. The thought of the incorrect milepost nagged at me. I wanted to re-examine it, to confirm what I had seen. As I approached the clearing again, my headlamp sweeping the path, I saw the post. I stopped, my heart thudding against my ribs. The number was different. It now read mile 11. I stared at it, disbelief warring with a growing sense of dread. I had just photographed mile 10 less than an hour ago. There was no way it could have changed. The paint was still fresh, the post still firmly planted. I checked my phone. The timestamp on the photograph confirmed I had taken it about 40 minutes prior. The image clearly showed mile 10. I took another photograph, capturing mile 11. My hands were shaking slightly from the cold, or perhaps from something else. The air felt sharper, the silence of the forest more profound, almost oppressive. I felt a sudden, intense isolation. I tried to rationalize it. Someone playing a prank? But who would be out here in the middle of the night, in this cold, just to repaint a milepost? And how could they have done it so quickly, without leaving any trace? I looked around, sweeping my headlamp beam through the trees, searching for any sign of another person. A discarded paint can, anything. There was nothing but the dense, dark forest. I decided to continue my run, but the incident had shattered my focus. My usual rhythm was gone, replaced by a heightened awareness of my surroundings. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, a primal instinct overriding my usual calm. I ran for another hour, pushing through the unease, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a misremembered detail, or some strange form of trail maintenance. I reached my planned turnaround point, a small stream crossing, and began the long run back. The thought of passing that milepost again filled me with a quiet dread. As I approached the clearing for the third time, my headlamp beam found the post. I slowed, my breath catching in my throat. The number had changed again. It now read, mile 12. This was the correct mileage according to my GPS. But the fact that it had shifted twice from 10 to 11 to 12 was deeply unsettling. I took a third photograph, documenting the latest change. The paint still looked fresh. There was no one around. The cold winds seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying no discernible sound, just a chilling presence. I finished my run, returning to my vehicle just as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to lighten the eastern sky. The entire drive home, I replayed the events in my mind, searching for a logical explanation. I reviewed my GPS track from the run. It showed a continuous, unbroken line, exactly the route I had taken. However, when I overlaid it with my previous runs, I noticed a subtle but distinct anomaly. Between the two ridges where the milepost was located, the recorded distance seemed slightly compressed, as if a small segment of the trail had been subtly shortened or shifted. It was not a major deviation, but enough to account for the discrepancy I had initially observed. The GPS data indicated a missing distance, a segment of about 2 miles that simply wasn't there in the same way it had been on previous runs. This was not a GPS error. The device had maintained a strong signal throughout. It was as if the physical space itself had been altered. The next day, I compiled a detailed report. I included the 3 photographs of the milepost, each showing a different number, along with the timestamps. I attached my GPS file, highlighting the section where the distance appeared to be missing. I sent the report to the local ranger station responsible for that section of the Appalachian Trail. I received an automated acknowledgement, then a call a few days later from a ranger. He listened patiently as I recounted the events, his tone professional but skeptical. He mentioned that trail markers were sometimes vandalized or replaced, but never in such a rapid, sequential manner. He also stated that GPS anomalies could occur, especially in dense forest or deep valleys, though he admitted my data seemed unusually consistent for a simple error. He promised to send a team to investigate the milepost and check the trail section. A week later, I received a follow-up call. The ranger informed me that their team had located the milepost. It was indeed marked mile 12, consistent with my final photograph and the actual trail mileage. They found no evidence of recent repainting, no discarded materials, and no signs of disturbance around the post. The paint, they reported, appeared weathered, consistent with its age. They also found no anomalies in the trail itself, no reroutes, no missing sections. Their own GPS data, collected during their survey, matched the official trail maps perfectly. The ranger suggested that perhaps I had been disoriented by the night and the cold, or that my phone's camera had somehow glitched. He closed the file, noting it as an unconfirmed report. I knew what I had seen. I had the photographs, the timestamps, and the GPS data. The evidence was clear, at least to me. The ranger's report, however, became the official record. I have not run that section of the trail at night since. The memory of that shifting milepost, the fresh paint that wasn't fresh, and the missing distance in my GPS file remains vivid. I still review the photographs sometimes, looking at the numbers, trying to find a flaw in my own perception. The quiet hum of the forest at night, once a comfort, now carries a different resonance. I was a night runner on the Appalachian Trail, covering sections after dark. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. That night, the shelter logbook felt unusually light in my hands. My routine involved traversing segments of the trail, often between dusk and dawn. I preferred the quiet solitude of the forest after the sun had set, the way the landscape simplified under the beam of a headlamp. This particular stretch was a known reroute, a temporary diversion around a washed-out section of the main path. The shelter, a lean-to structure of wood and tin, sat in a shallow hollow, a few hundred yards off the new route. It was a familiar stop, a place where I would often pause, sign the log, and check for any urgent messages left by caretakers or other hikers. The air was still, barely above freezing, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A thin layer of frost coated the exposed surfaces of the shelter's wooden bench. I pulled out my headlamp, adjusting the beam to a wide flood, and located the logbook. It was a standard-issue, spiral-bound notebook kept in a small, waterproof plastic box. I opened the box, then the book, flipping to the last few pages. My intention was to sign in, note the time, and perhaps add a brief observation about the trail conditions. The page was blank, not just unsigned, but entirely empty. I blinked, then adjusted the headlamp's angle, thinking it was a trick of the low light. The paper was clean, unmarred by any ink. I flipped back a page, then another, and another. All were pristine, as if never written upon. This was unusual. Hikers were diligent about signing in, especially at a shelter on a reroute. It was a safety measure, a way to track movement in case of an emergency. I checked the previous entries, going back several days. They were all there, clear and legible, filled with names, dates, and short notes. The blank pages began about 3 entries back from what should have been the current date. I ran my fingers over the paper. The texture felt normal, slightly rough from the recycled pulp. There was no sign of erasure, no smudges or tears. The pages were intact, the fibers undisturbed. It was as if the ink had simply vanished, lifted cleanly from the surface without leaving a trace. I leaned closer, angling the light from my headlamp sharply across the page, almost parallel to the paper itself. In that raking light, a faint impression became visible. It was not ink, but the ghost of pressure. The indentations left by a pen. I moved the light slowly, tracing the faint lines. A date, then what appeared to be a name. The letters were shallow, almost imperceptible. I focused, trying to make out the full name. It was difficult, requiring precise angles of light and intense concentration. The first name seemed to be Ethan. The surname was harder, a series of loops and straight lines, possibly Miller. Below that, a short message, also just indentations. It was too faint to decipher fully, but I could make out a few words. Late, cold, waiting. The last entry, the one that should have been the most recent, was the clearest. It was just a single word pressed deeply into the paper. Gone. The chill in the air seemed to deepen. I sat on the shelter bench, the plastic box with the logbook resting on my knees. The isolation of the forest pressed in, the usual comforting silence now feeling heavy and watchful. I took out my phone, but there was no signal here, as expected. The nearest point of reception was several miles back, near the highway access road. I took a few photographs of the blank pages, trying to capture the faint indentations with my phone's flash, though I knew it was unlikely to work well. The headlamp's raking light was the only way to see them. I closed the logbook, carefully placing it back into its waterproof container. My initial plan to continue my run was now secondary. This felt like more than just an oddity. A missing log entry, especially one with such peculiar characteristics, suggested a problem. The trail was generally safe, but vanishings did occur, often without explanation. The blank pages, the lifted ink, the deep, final indentation of gone. It all felt deliberate, not accidental. I decided to cut my run short and report the anomaly. I began the trek back to my vehicle, moving at a faster pace than before. The gravel underfoot crunched loudly in the quiet night. My mind replayed the image of the blank pages, the invisible writing. The forest felt different now, less welcoming. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig seemed amplified. I reached the trailhead parking area about an hour later. My truck was the only vehicle there. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that had begun to roll in. Once I reached an area with cell service, I called the local park ranger dispatch. I explained the situation calmly, detailing the blank pages, the lifted ink, and the visible indentations under specific lighting. The dispatcher listened, taking down the information. They seemed to understand the unusual nature of the report. They said they would contact the caretaker for that section of the trail and initiate a preliminary check. I was asked to secure the logbook and bring it to the ranger station in the morning. The next morning, I drove to the ranger station. The fog had lifted, replaced by a clear, cold sky. I handed over the logbook. A ranger, a man named Miller, examined it under a bright desk lamp. He tried various angles, but the indentations were difficult to see without the precise, focused beam of a headlamp. I explained how I had seen them. He then used a specialized forensic light, and the faint impressions became clearer. He photographed the pages, using different light filters. The caretaker for that section of the trail was contacted. He confirmed that a hiker named Ethan Miller had been expected at that shelter a few nights prior. He had signed in at a shelter further south and had indicated his intention to reach the reroute shelter. He was hiking alone. The caretaker had not seen him. A search and rescue operation was initiated. Teams were deployed to the reroute and the surrounding trail sections. They found no trace of Ethan Miller. No gear, no footprints, no discarded items. It was as if he had simply stepped off the trail and vanished. The logbook became a central piece of evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed the indentations were made by a standard ballpoint pen. They were consistent with the handwriting of Ethan Miller, based on comparisons with his previous log entries from other shelters. The process by which the ink had been removed remained a mystery. There was no chemical residue, no signs of abrasion. It was as if the ink had simply evaporated, leaving only the pressure marks behind. The word "gone," pressed so deeply into the paper, offered no further clues. The search for Ethan Miller continued for several weeks. It eventually scaled back, then was suspended. His file remains open, classified as a missing person. The official report noted the unusual state of the shelter logbook, but offered no explanation for it. I was interviewed multiple times, asked to recount the exact conditions under which I found the logbook, the precise angle of my headlamp. My testimony was consistent. I still run the trails, but the experience changed something. I check every logbook with a different kind of scrutiny now. The quiet of the forest no longer feels entirely benign. Sometimes, when I'm alone on a remote section of trail, the wind will pick up, and I imagine I hear a faint whisper, like paper rustling in the dark. It is a sound that carries no words, only the echo of something absent. I was running a section of the Appalachian Trail, checking on shelter conditions. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and the forest was dark. My handheld radio crackled with an unusual, distant static. I am a volunteer for a regional trail conservancy, responsible for routine inspections and minor maintenance. My usual route involved a 20-mile loop, often completed after dark to avoid daytime hiker traffic. The trail was familiar, a ribbon of packed earth and loose gravel winding through the ridges and gaps. I carried a small pack with basic tools, a first aid kit, and a ham radio for emergency communications. The repeater on Bald Mountain provided excellent coverage across this particular section, a reliable link to the outside world. My headlamp cut a bright path through the dense forest, illuminating the frost-covered leaves and the occasional cairn. The silence of the night was usually profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the distant hum of the highway far below. On this particular night, the silence was different. The static on the repeater frequency was persistent, a low background hiss that suggested a weak signal or interference. I had just passed the turnoff for Black Bear Gap, about 3 miles from the next shelter. My handheld was set to monitor the local repeater, a standard procedure. The air was still and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I paused to adjust my headlamp, pulling my hat lower against the chill. That was when the static intensified, then resolved into something more distinct. It was a voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single word. The word was Mayday. The voice was thin, almost a whisper, layered with the sound of a struggling engine. It was not a ham radio transmission. The frequency was wrong for a standard distress call, and the modulation sounded like a CB radio bleeding into the repeater. This was not uncommon. Powerful CB rigs could sometimes override other frequencies, especially in mountainous terrain. The Mayday repeated, a low, urgent plea. I checked my watch. It was a little past 11 o'clock. I tried to key up, to ask for identification, but the signal was too weak, too unstable. It faded back into static, then returned. The same single word, the same engine noise. The transmission lasted for perhaps 30 seconds before disappearing completely. I continued my run, keeping the radio on, listening. The forest felt heavier now, the isolation more pronounced. I reached the next shelter, a small, 3-sided log structure, about an hour later. The logbook inside was empty for the past few days. I signed my name, noted the time, and then sat on a wooden bench, pulling out my second handheld radio. This one was a different model, a backup. I powered it on, tuned it to the repeater frequency, and waited. The air inside the shelter was cold, but out of the wind it felt less sharp. I ate a granola bar and drank some water, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the darkness. Just as I was about to pack up, the signal returned. It was the same voice, the same Mayday, the same engine sound. I checked my watch again. It was almost exactly 20 minutes since the first transmission. The repetition was precise. I tried to transmit, to break through the interference, but there was no response. The signal was a one-way street, a ghost in the machine. I made a mental note of the time, then continued my route towards the next ridge saddle. The trail grew steeper, the footing more treacherous with loose rock and patches of frost. The fog began to roll in, a thick, damp blanket that reduced visibility to a few feet beyond my headlamp beam. The cold intensified, seeping into my gear. I kept both handhelds on, one clipped to my pack strap, the other in my hand. The repeater was usually clear, a strong signal from its high elevation. This bleed-through was unusual, not just for its persistence, but for its content. A Mayday is not something to ignore, even if it sounds like a phantom. The third transmission came exactly 20 minutes after the second. Mayday, the voice whispered, accompanied by the struggling engine. It was unnerving. The precise timing suggested either a deliberate automated broadcast or something far stranger. I pulled out my third radio, a small, older model, and turned it on. I wanted to compare the internal clocks. All three radios had been synchronized to a network time server before I left. They should have been identical. I looked at the displays. They all showed the same minute and second, but the hour was off on one of them by a full hour. The other two agreed. This was impossible. Digital clocks do not drift like that, especially not by a full hour, and certainly not when synchronized. I checked the settings on the anomalous radio. Everything appeared normal. I tried to contact dispatch on a different frequency, a direct line, but the signal was weak. The fog was thickening, creating a localized radio blackout. I was in a dead zone, a common occurrence in the deep valleys and dense forest. The Mayday repeated again, precisely on schedule. I was now actively tracking the intervals. Each transmission lasted about 30 seconds, then silence, then static, then the next loop. The voice never changed, never added new information. It was a recording, or something that behaved like one. The engine sound was a low rumble, a strained cough, then a whine. It sounded like a vehicle trying to start, failing, then trying again. I reached a small reroute, a temporary path around a fallen tree. The ground was soft and muddy here, the air heavy with moisture. My boots sank slightly with each step. The fourth Mayday came. I was now actively trying to triangulate the source, walking in slow circles, holding the radio high. The signal strength indicator on my primary handheld flickered, showing a slight increase when I faced northwest, towards the general direction of Bald Mountain. But the source was not the repeater itself. It was bleeding into the repeater. This meant the original signal was likely coming from somewhere within the repeater's coverage zone, possibly a valley or a remote trailhead. I decided to head towards the nearest gap trailhead, a place where vehicles sometimes parked overnight. It was a few miles off my planned route, but it was the most logical place to find a stranded vehicle. The fog was now so dense I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. The trail markers were indistinct blurs. I relied on my internal compass and the faint glow of my headlamp. The cold was biting, a deep chill that penetrated my layers. The Mayday continued its 20-minute cycle. Each time it came, it felt more urgent, more personal, despite its unchanging nature. The clock drift on my third radio persisted, showing a full hour difference from the other two, which remained synchronized. I reached the trailhead parking lot about an hour later. It was empty. No vehicles, no signs of recent activity. The gravel lot was undisturbed, covered in a thin layer of frost. The fog was so thick here that the headlights of my parked truck, a few miles down the highway, would not have been visible. I stood in the middle of the lot, listening to the silence, broken only by the distant rhythmic Mayday. It was now coming from the repeater, clear as day, no longer faint. The signal strength was strong. This meant the source was either very close to the repeater antenna, or the repeater itself was somehow rebroadcasting a stored signal. Neither explanation made sense. I pulled out my Hamnet log, a small notebook I carried for recording unusual radio activity. I began to write down the times of each Mayday transmission, noting the 20-minute interval. I also recorded the discrepancy in my radio clocks. The two synchronized radios showed, for example, 12 minutes past midnight, while the third showed 12 minutes past 1 o'clock. This was a consistent, unwavering difference. It was not a simple time zone error, as all radios were set to local time. It was as if one device was operating on a different temporal plane. The thought was unsettling. I spent the next few hours patrolling the immediate area around the trailhead, walking the short access roads, listening for any sound other than the repeating Mayday. The forest was still, the fog a silent presence. I found no evidence of a stranded vehicle, no tire tracks, no footprints other than my own. The cold was relentless. I considered calling dispatch again, but I knew the radio blackout was still in effect. I was on my own with this looping distress call. The lack of any other sound, any other human presence, amplified the strangeness of the situation. The Mayday was the only voice in the vast, dark forest. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift, revealing the frost-covered trees in the pale light of the rising sun. The Mayday transmissions continued, unwavering. I decided to hike directly to the repeater site on Bald Mountain. It was a steep climb, but I needed to investigate the source directly. The air grew colder as I gained elevation, the ground crunching underfoot. The repeater cabin, a small metal structure, came into view as I broke through the tree line. It was secured, the antenna tower humming faintly in the morning air. There was no sign of tampering, no unusual equipment. I used my key to enter the cabin. Inside, the equipment hummed, the racks of radios and power supplies glowing with indicator lights. Everything appeared normal. I checked the repeater's log files, looking for any anomalies, any record of the CB bleed-through. There was nothing. The log showed standard traffic, no unusual signals. I stood there, listening to the faint, persistent Mayday coming from my handheld radio. It was still looping, still on its 20-minute cycle. The repeater itself was not broadcasting it. It was simply repeating it, as it was designed to do. The signal was coming from somewhere else, somewhere within its coverage, but it was not being logged by the repeater's internal system. I spent another hour at the site, checking connections, running diagnostics. The equipment was functioning perfectly. I even tried to transmit on the CB band to see if I could hear myself on the repeater. My signal came through clearly, but the Mayday persisted, an independent entity. I took a photograph of the repeater's control panel, noting the time displayed on its internal clock. It matched my two synchronized handhelds. The third radio, still clipped to my pack, continued to show the hour difference. It was a detail that defied explanation. I eventually descended the mountain, the Mayday still echoing in the background. I filed a detailed report with the Conservancy, outlining the unusual radio activity and the clock discrepancy. The report was forwarded to local dispatch and the amateur radio emergency services. They found no missing persons reports matching the description of a stranded vehicle or a Mayday call in that specific area. There was no evidence of a vehicle accident, no trace of a signal source. The Hamnet log I submitted became part of a larger file, an unsolved incident. The official conclusion was a rare atmospheric condition combined with a powerful, distant CB radio, possibly from a truck on a far-off highway, creating an unusual skip phenomenon. The clock discrepancy was attributed to a faulty internal oscillator in my older radio, despite its previous reliability. I accepted the explanation, but it did not fully account for the precise 20-minute loop or the consistent nature of the Mayday itself. The incident was closed, filed away as an anomaly. I still run that section of the trail. Sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in and the air is cold, I find myself listening for that specific static. I still check my radios, comparing their internal clocks. The memory of that looping Mayday remains, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. A sound that wouldn't let go. I was a night runner, covering a familiar section of the Appalachian Trail. It was late fall, the air crisp and dark, barely above freezing. Then I saw the light, a distinct strobe flashing from a distant saddle. I had been moving for a few hours, pushing through the cold air. The trail was a narrow ribbon of packed earth, winding through dense forest. My headlamp cut a tunnel of light ahead, illuminating the frost-covered leaves. I focused on my breathing, the rhythmic crunch of my shoes on the gravel. The isolation of the mountains at night was usually a comfort. I knew this stretch well, every dip and rise. My route took me along a ridge, offering occasional views of the valleys below. It was during one of these clearings that I first noticed it, a small, bright pulse of light, far off in the darkness. It was not a steady beam, but a rapid, intermittent flash. The pattern was unusual, too fast for a typical headlamp. I stopped, pulling out my binoculars, and scanned the distant ridge. The strobe continued, unwavering, from a saddle about 3 miles away. It was a place I knew, a common crossing point for hikers. But no one should have been there at this hour, especially not with a light like that. My routine involved careful planning and preparation. I always carried a satellite communicator, a robust first aid kit, and extra layers. My runs were usually solo, but I always informed a contact of my route and expected return time. I understood the risks of the Appalachian Trail, especially after dark. Wildlife was a constant presence, and the weather could shift without warning. I had encountered other night hikers before, but their lights were always steady, a consistent beam cutting through the dark. This strobe was different. It felt urgent, almost frantic. I considered my options. My primary concern was always safety, both my own and that of others on the trail. I knew the local ranger station had a small outpost a few miles from my current position. I decided to observe for a few more minutes before making a call. The light continued its rapid pulse, a silent signal in the vast darkness. I watched the strobe for what felt like a long time, perhaps 10 minutes. The cold seeped into my bones as I stood still. The light maintained its strange, quick rhythm. It was too regular for nature, too bright for a distant star. I activated my satellite communicator, sending a brief message to my contact. Then I switched to the emergency channel, hoping to reach the ranger station. The radio crackled with static for a moment before a voice responded. It was Ranger Miller, a familiar presence on the trail. I described what I was seeing, the location of the saddle, and the unusual nature of the light. Miller confirmed he understood and would check his own instruments. He asked me to maintain visual contact if possible. A few minutes later, Miller called back. He had also spotted the light from his outpost, though his view was partially obscured by the ridge. He confirmed the strobe was not a known beacon. He mentioned another team, a pair of volunteers, was on a patrol about 5 miles to the north, on the opposite side of the saddle. He would contact them and coordinate a convergence. Both teams would approach the saddle from different directions. I was to remain at my vantage point, providing updates on the light's status. I agreed, pulling my jacket tighter against the increasing cold. The air felt sharper, carrying a faint whisper of wind through the pines. I continued to observe the strobe through my binoculars. The light seemed to pulse with an almost mechanical precision. There was no wavering, no sign of human movement around it. It was simply a flashing point of light. I relayed this information to Miller. He confirmed the northern team, led by a volunteer named Sarah, was moving towards the saddle. Their approach would be slower, as they were on foot and carrying heavier gear. Miller himself was preparing to drive to a closer trailhead and then hike in. The coordination was precise, standard for potential search and rescue. The strobe continued for another half hour, Then, without warning, it stopped. Its sudden absence was more jarring than its presence. The darkness felt deeper, more absolute. I immediately reported this to Miller. He acknowledged, instructing both teams to proceed with caution. He emphasized locating the strobe's source, not engaging with anything unknown. The forest was silent, save for rustling leaves and the distant hum of the highway. I scanned the saddle area repeatedly with my binoculars, but there was nothing. Just the dark, unyielding outline of the ridge against the faint starlight. I waited, shivering slightly, for updates from the converging teams. The radio remained quiet for a long stretch. Then, Sarah's voice came through, slightly breathless. They had reached the saddle. There was no sign of a person, no equipment, no headlamp. Nothing. Miller then reported his arrival from the southern approach. He confirmed Sarah's assessment. The saddle was empty. They conducted a preliminary search of the immediate area, sweeping their powerful lights across the ground. There was no evidence of recent activity. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. It was as if the light had simply vanished into thin air. Miller decided to deploy his thermal monocular. Sarah received the same instruction. They began a systematic sweep of the saddle, focusing on the area where I had pinpointed the strobe. The thermal imaging device detected heat signatures, even residual warmth. After a few minutes, Miller's voice came back over the radio, tinged with a note of surprise. He had found something. A distinct oval in the grass, about the size of a large backpack, registered significantly cooler than the surrounding ground. It was as if something warm had been there, and then had been removed, leaving a cold spot. Sarah confirmed a similar finding on her side of the saddle, though her thermal reading was less distinct. The cooled area matched my observed strobe location. Miller took several photographs of the anomaly with his thermal camera. The edges were sharp, not diffused, suggesting recent removal. The temperature differential was notable, indicating something warm had been there, then was gone. This was not natural. The ground was already barely above freezing, but this spot was colder still. The teams expanded their search, moving outward from the saddle. They checked surrounding trees for any device or person hiding. They found nothing. The trail logbook at the nearest shelter, about a mile from the saddle, was checked. No entries showed anyone passing through in the last several hours. No one had signed in or out. This added to the mystery. If someone had been there, standard procedure was not followed. Miller filed an official report that night. It detailed my initial sighting, the coordinated response, and the thermal anomaly. The report noted no physical evidence, no footprints, and the strobe's unusual nature. The incident was classified as unexplained. The thermal clip became the primary evidence in the file. The area was marked for further investigation in daylight. The next morning, a larger team returned to the saddle. They conducted a more thorough grid search. They found nothing. No discarded batteries, no broken equipment, no disturbed earth. The cooled spot dissipated with the morning sun, leaving no trace. The ground was firm, mostly rock and compacted soil, making clear footprints difficult. But even so, the complete lack of any sign was unsettling. The forest was quiet, indifferent to the previous night's events. I provided my own statement, recounting everything I had seen and heard. My account aligned with Miller's observations and thermal data. The incident was discussed at length among the rangers and volunteers. Theories ranged from a prankster with advanced equipment to a malfunctioning weather balloon. None fully accounted for the precise, rapid strobe, its sudden disappearance, and the distinct thermal signature. The location's isolation, far from roads or permanent structures, made a simple explanation difficult. The hum of the forest remained, but now it carried a subtle undercurrent of unease. The incident remained an open file. No further evidence ever surfaced. The thermal clip became the central piece of documentation, a silent testament to something that had been present and then was not. The official report concluded with the designation, "Unexplained Phenomenon." There were no missing persons reports filed in the region that could be linked to the event. No one came forward claiming to have been on the saddle that night. The trail logbook remained blank for that period. The experience left a subtle but persistent unease. I continued my night runs, but my perception of the trail had shifted. The familiar isolation now felt less comforting, more watchful. The darkness seemed to hold more secrets. I found myself scanning distant ridges more often, searching for any anomaly. The memory of that rapid, silent strobe was difficult to shake. It was a reminder that even in the most familiar places, there could be events that defied all logical explanation, leaving only questions in their wake. Sometimes, when I am out on the trail at night, the air cold and still, I find myself pausing. I listen to the whisper of the wind through the trees, the distant hum of the highway. I look towards the dark outline of the ridges, particularly that saddle. I still see that light in my mind, flashing with an impossible precision. It was a signal from nowhere, for no one, leaving only a cold spot in the grass. I wonder what it was, and where it went. I was a night runner on the Appalachian Trail, training for longer events. The air was crisp, barely above freezing, as I started from the Gap trailhead. I noticed a temporary detour placard placed at an unexpected junction. I had been running sections of the Appalachian Trail at night for several years. It was part of my routine, a way to clear my head and push my endurance. The solitude of the forest after dark was a familiar comfort, a quiet hum broken only by my own footsteps and the distant sounds of the highway. This particular night, the late autumn chill had settled in, bringing with it a thin layer of frost that crunched under my trail shoes. I had started my run just after midnight, heading north from a well-known trailhead near a small town. My route was a familiar loop, one I had completed dozens of times in all conditions. The trail markers were always clear, the white blazes distinct even in the beam of my headlamp. About 3 miles in, I approached a minor junction, a place where a short spur trail branched off towards an old cabin. This junction was always straightforward. Tonight, however, a bright orange detour placard stood planted firmly in the ground, its reflective surface catching my light. It indicated a reroute to the east, away from my planned path. This was unusual. I had not seen any notices about trail work or closures. Context. My experience on the trail was extensive. I understood the system of blazes, the standard signage, and the protocols for trail maintenance. Reroutes were not uncommon, especially after heavy storms or during specific construction projects. However, these were always announced, often with multiple signs leading up to the affected section, and details posted at trailheads or online. This sign was an anomaly. It was a standard issue placard, the kind used by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, but its presence here felt wrong. The trail ahead was a well-maintained section, known for its clear path and minimal blowdowns. I checked my small handheld GPS unit, a habit born from caution. but it showed my planned route as open. Still, a detour sign, especially one that looked official, usually meant something. I considered turning back, but the thought of a legitimate reroute, perhaps a new hazard I was unaware of, made me hesitate. I decided to follow the sign, assuming it was a recent development that hadn't yet been widely publicized. The night was still, the forest quiet, and the only sound was the soft rustle of dry leaves as I changed direction. Incident. I turned onto the path indicated by the orange placard. The initial few hundred feet were passable, though noticeably less maintained than the main trail. The ground was softer, the undergrowth thicker, and the blazes, when I found them, were older, faded, and spaced further apart. My headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing a path that felt increasingly unfamiliar. The air grew colder as I descended into a small hollow. The trail became rougher, marked by numerous blowdowns, fallen trees that required climbing over or detouring around. This was not the kind of reroute I expected on a well-trafficked section of the AT. Standard reroutes typically followed existing, albeit less used paths or fire roads, not a forgotten track through dense forest. I checked my GPS again. It showed me moving further and further off my intended course, deeper into an area marked on the map as dense, untracked woods. The blazes I was following were now barely visible, just faint smears of white paint on ancient tree trunks, some partially obscured by moss. They looked decades old, not part of a recent reroute. A sense of unease began to settle over me. The silence of the forest felt heavier here, the usual night sounds absent. There was no distant hum of the highway, no rustle of small animals. It was just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my shoes on the leaf litter. I continued for what felt like another mile, navigating around more blowdowns, pushing through thorny bushes. The path was clearly not maintained. It was a forgotten trace, perhaps an old logging road or a hunter's path, long abandoned. The thought that I had been deliberately misled began to form. I stopped, turning off my headlamp for a moment. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides. I could feel the cold seeping into my clothes. I turned my light back on, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the black. I made the decision to turn back. The return journey was slower, more cautious. I retraced my steps, carefully following the faint blazes back towards the junction. The blowdowns seemed more numerous now, the path more obscure. I felt a growing urgency, a need to get back to the familiar, well-marked trail. The entire experience had taken well over an hour, pushing me far beyond my planned turnaround time. When I finally reached the junction where I had first seen the orange placard, it was gone. The ground where it had been planted was undisturbed. No sign of a recent stake. The main trail was clear, just as it always was. There was no evidence that the detour sign had ever been there. Escalation. I completed my run, shaken but physically unharmed. The next morning, I filed a detailed report with the local park service. I described the exact location of the junction, the appearance of the detour placard, and the condition of the unmaintained path I had followed. I also noted the sign's disappearance upon my return. The ranger on duty listened carefully, taking notes. He assured me they would investigate immediately. A few days later, I received a call from the ranger. He confirmed that a team had gone out to the specified junction. They found no sign of a temporary reroute placard. The main trail was clear, and the spur trail to the old cabin was as it always had been. However, the ranger also mentioned something else. About 3 miles further north along the main trail, at a different, legitimate junction, they had found a temporary detour placard. This placard, he explained, was identical to the one I had described. It was zip-tied to a tree, indicating a reroute around a section of trail that had indeed suffered significant blowdowns from a recent windstorm. The rangers sent me photographs of the sign. It was exactly as I remembered it. The same orange color, the same font, the same reflective material. What was unsettling was his next observation. The zip ties holding the placard to the tree were brand new. They showed no signs of weathering or age. The ranger also checked the maintenance log for that section of the trail. The log indicated that the reroute placard at the correct junction had been placed there by a trail crew about 2 weeks prior, using older standard-issue zip ties. There was no record of any placard being placed or moved in the area I had initially described. The ranger's team had found the original, older zip ties cut and lying on the ground beneath the sign at the correct junction. The new ties were a recent addition. This meant the sign had been moved from its correct location, placed at the wrong junction to mislead me, and then moved back to its original, correct position, secured with fresh ties. The implication was clear. Someone had deliberately taken the sign, used it to divert hikers onto a dangerous, unmaintained path, and then returned it to its proper place, covering their tracks. Aftermath. The Park Service filed an official report detailing the incident. The logbook entry for that section of the trail was updated to include my testimony and the ranger's findings regarding the zip ties. There was no explanation for who might have moved the sign or why. No other hikers reported a similar experience from that specific night, though the trail was less frequented after dark. The incident remained an open question, a procedural anomaly without a clear cause or perpetrator. The ranger suggested it might have been a prank, but the effort involved, moving a sign several miles, then returning it and replacing the ties, seemed excessive for a simple joke. The official file noted the discrepancy between my initial observation and the subsequent discovery of the sign at its correct location with new fastenings. It was logged as an unusual incident, a temporary misplacement of trail signage, with the cause undetermined. The trail itself remained unchanged, the forest silent and indifferent. I still run that section of the trail, sometimes at night. I always check that specific junction now, even though I know the sign will not be there. The memory of that unmaintained path, the deep isolation, and the quiet dread of being deliberately misled stays with me. The forest holds its secrets, and sometimes, it seems, it allows them to whisper. I was a dedicated night runner, often on the Appalachian Trail. It was late autumn, the air crisp and the ground covered in dry leaves. That night, I heard something behind me that should not have been there. My routine involved long, solitary runs after dark, usually starting around midnight. The trail offered a unique quietude then, a different kind of challenge. I preferred the ridge saddles, where the path was less technical and the forest felt more open. I always carried a headlamp, a small first aid kit, and a compact audio recorder. The recorder was mostly for personal notes, a habit developed over years of solo expeditions. This particular night, the sky was clear, showing a sliver of moon. The temperature was barely above freezing, a sharp cold that invigorated the lungs. I was moving at a steady pace, about 3 miles into a planned 10-mile loop. The only sounds were my own breathing and the rhythmic crunch of my trail shoes on the thick leaf litter. Then, a distinct sound registered behind me. It was another set of footsteps, matching my cadence, slightly off rhythm. It was not an echo. The sound was too precise, too heavy. I slowed my pace slightly, listening more intently. The footsteps behind me also slowed. I stopped completely, holding my breath. The forest went silent, save for the hum of distant highway traffic. I waited for a moment, then continued running. The footsteps resumed, keeping pace. My experience on the trail was extensive. I had spent years navigating these paths, both day and night. I knew the local wildlife, the sounds of the wind, the way the forest shifted in the dark. I understood the difference between a deer moving through brush and a human step on the ground. This was undeniably human. The section of trail I was on was a reroute, a newer path that bypassed a washed-out section of the old trail. It was less frequented, even during the day. At night, it was almost guaranteed solitude. There were no shelters nearby, no cabins, no known campsites for at least a few miles in either direction. The nearest trailhead was a good hour's hike back, and the next access point was even further. I always took precautions. My headlamp was fully charged, its beam cutting a bright tunnel through the absolute darkness of the forest. I wore reflective gear, though it seemed unnecessary out here. My small radio was on my belt, set to a local emergency frequency, though signal was rare in the deeper woods. The isolation was part of the appeal, but it also demanded respect. I had never encountered another person on this specific stretch of trail after dark. The footsteps continued. I tried to dismiss them at first, attributing them to an overactive imagination or the rustling of leaves. But the sound was too consistent, too deliberate. It was the distinct sound of heavy boots on dry leaves, a rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch that mirrored my own stride. I was running at a fast clip, a pace that would challenge most hikers. Whoever was behind me was keeping up effortlessly. I glanced over my shoulder, sweeping my headlamp beam across the narrow path. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the undergrowth, the trail itself. There was nothing. No reflective gear, no glint of an eye, no shape of a body, just the empty trail, stretching back into the blackness. The beam of my headlamp was powerful, easily capable of picking up another light source or a person at a distance of several yards. There was no other light. I continued running, pushing my pace slightly. The footsteps behind me also picked up speed. I could feel a growing unease, a cold prickle on my skin despite the exertion. This was not a friendly encounter. If someone wanted to pass, they would have called out. If they were lost, they would have asked for help. This was silent, persistent pursuit. I decided to test it. I veered sharply off the main path, taking a quick, almost silent detour through a patch of dense rhododendron. The leaves brushed against my jacket, making a soft rustling sound. I stopped behind a thick tree, holding my breath, my headlamp off. The forest plunged into absolute darkness. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps continued on the main trail for a few more strides, then stopped. There was a moment of silence. Then, I heard the distinct sound of leaves being disturbed, moving off the main path in my general direction. It was not a random rustle. It was a deliberate movement, a careful tracking. I pressed myself against the tree bark, trying to become invisible. The sound of movement came closer, slow and methodical. I could hear the distinct crunch of leaves, closer than before. I could feel the cold air on my face, the damp earth beneath my feet. There was no light, no sound of breathing, Nothing but the footsteps. It felt like an animal stalking prey, but the sound was too heavy, too human. I waited for what felt like an eternity, probably only a minute or two. The footsteps seemed to circle slowly, just out of my direct line of sight. I could not see anything, but I could hear the movement. The hair on my neck stood on end. This was beyond unsettling. I made a decision. I would not engage. I would run. I burst from my hiding spot, turning my headlamp back on and sprinted back onto the main trail. I ran faster than I had ever run before, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The footsteps immediately resumed behind me, matching my frantic pace. I did not look back again. I focused solely on the path ahead, the narrow beam of my headlamp illuminating the ground. The sound of the footsteps was constant, a relentless rhythm behind me. It was a heavy, determined sound, never faltering. I pushed myself to the absolute limit, desperate to outrun whatever was following me. The cold air burned in my throat. The forest felt like a suffocating tunnel. I ran for what felt like an impossibly long time, probably close to an hour. My body screamed in protest, but the fear propelled me forward. The trail eventually began a gradual descent, leading towards a gravel access road that connected to a small highway. I knew this section well. It was my escape route. As I neared the gravel road, I could faintly hear the hum of distant traffic. The sound was a small comfort, a reminder of civilization. I pushed harder, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly with my frantic strides. The footsteps behind me remained constant, unwavering. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road. I did not slow down. I turned left, heading towards the highway, about a mile away. The gravel crunched loudly under my shoes. I expected the footsteps behind me to change, to perhaps hesitate on the different terrain. They did not. The heavy crunching continued on the gravel, just as it had on the leaf litter. I reached the highway, a two-lane road with occasional passing headlights. I did not stop. I ran along the shoulder, my headlamp still blazing, my eyes scanning for any sign of a vehicle. The footsteps were still there, behind me, on the gravel shoulder. I could hear them clearly over the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant traffic. A vehicle approached from the direction of town, its headlights growing brighter. I waved frantically, hoping the driver would see me. The car slowed, then pulled over a short distance ahead. I reached the passenger door, yanked it open, and practically fell inside. The driver, a young man, looked at me with a startled expression. I gasped that someone was following me, pointing back towards the trail entrance. No light, just footsteps. The driver, clearly confused but sensing my genuine distress, looked back. He saw nothing. I told him I needed to get away, to the nearest ranger station or police office. He agreed and we drove off. I kept looking out the rear window but saw nothing but the dark forest and the empty road. Once I was safe, sitting in the warmth of the ranger station, the adrenaline began to recede. My body ached and a deep tremor ran through me. I recounted the events to the ranger on duty, a man named Miller. He listened patiently, taking notes. I mentioned the audio recorder. I had it running the whole time, I said, my voice still shaky. It should have picked up everything. Miller retrieved the small device from my pack. We listened to the recording together. The first part was normal, just my breathing and the sound of my shoes. Then, clearly audible, came the distinct, heavy footsteps behind me. They were exactly as I remembered them, a relentless, rhythmic crunch. We listened as I sped up, as the footsteps sped up. We listened as I veered off the trail and the footsteps followed. We listened to my frantic sprint and the steady pursuit. Then, the recording continued. I had stopped running when I got into the car. The audio showed my breathing slowing, the sound of the car door, the engine. But the footsteps did not stop. They continued for another 11 minutes, a steady, rhythmic crunch, 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 fading slightly as the car drove away, but still distinctly present. They were not my footsteps, nor the car's sounds. They were the pursuing steps, continuing on the gravel shoulder, long after I was gone. The ranger, Miller, looked at me with a new expression, a mixture of concern and something else I could not quite place. He replayed that final section several times. The evidence was undeniable. The footsteps continued, clear and distinct, for a significant duration after I had left the scene. A formal report was filed. Park rangers conducted a search of the area the following morning. They found no tracks other than my own. There was no sign of a person, no discarded items, no indication that anyone else had been on that trail or gravel road. The ground was firm, the leaf litter undisturbed except by my passage. The frost had settled overnight, leaving no fresh prints. The audio recording was submitted as evidence. It was analyzed by a specialist who confirmed the presence of distinct, heavy footfalls separate from my own. The specialist could not identify the source. The file was eventually closed, marked as an unexplained incident. There was no explanation, no logical reason for their persistence. I stopped running at night after that. The isolation of the trail, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. I still go out during the day, but the experience changed something fundamental in me. The sound of dry leaves underfoot can still trigger a cold dread. I sometimes find myself listening, straining to hear something that isn't there. The memory of those unseen, relentless footsteps remains vivid, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. I still hear it sometimes. I was a night runner, often taking to the Appalachian Trail after dark. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and a thin fog clung to the ridge saddles. My truck's dash cam, a standard security measure, recorded something that defied a simple explanation. I had parked my pickup in a small gap lot, a familiar trailhead access point deep in the mountains. The lot was usually empty at that hour, surrounded by dense forest. My routine involved setting the dash cam to record continuously, pointed towards the trail entrance and the front of the truck. This provided a record of my departure and return, a small comfort in the isolation. On this particular night, I planned a longer loop, heading towards a distant shelter and back. The cold was sharp, but the trail was clear. I checked my gear, locked the truck, and started my run. The only light came from my headlamp and the distant glow of a few pole lights in the lot. The gravel crunched under my feet as I moved away from the vehicle, the sound echoing briefly in the quiet night. Later, reviewing the footage, I would see myself arriving back at the truck at a time that simply did not make sense. The camera's internal clock showed my return before my departure. Night running on the Appalachian Trail was a specific discipline. I found a unique solitude in the darkness, a quiet that daytime hikers never experienced. The cooler temperatures were also ideal for longer distances, especially during the warmer months. I knew these sections of the trail intimately, the subtle shifts in terrain, the roots and rocks hidden by shadow. My truck served as a mobile base camp, always stocked with emergency supplies and a reliable communication setup. The dashcam was part of that preparedness, a simple record keeper. It captured the empty lot, the occasional passing car on the highway, and the ambient sounds of the forest. I trusted its function, its steady recording of events. The isolation of these gap trailheads meant few witnesses to anything, which was part of their appeal. The camera had always been reliable, its internal clock synchronized with network time, providing an accurate log of my movements. This consistency was a fundamental aspect of my routine, a silent assurance in the deep forest. My run that night followed a familiar reroute, past an unused cabin, and back along a ridge saddle. The air was still. Only my breathing and the soft crunch of my trail shoes broke the silence. Distant highway headlights occasionally cut through the trees. The forest was a wall of black, broken only by my headlamp. I ran for what felt like a couple of hours, pushing through the cold. The trail was clear. I reached my turnaround point, drank some water, and began the return. The descent felt faster, the cold biting harder. As I approached the gap lot, I saw the faint glow of the pole lights. My truck was exactly where I had left it, a dark silhouette. I walked the final yards, feeling the relief of completing a long run. The gravel crunched under my feet. I unlocked the truck, stowed my gear, and started the engine. Before driving away, I always checked the dashcam footage, a habit born of caution. I wanted to ensure no wildlife or unexpected events had occurred. I navigated the camera's menu, pulling up the recording from my run. The display showed the continuous feed. I fast-forwarded to the point where I had left the truck. The timestamp on the video showed me walking away from the vehicle. I noted the time displayed on the screen. Then I skipped forward to my return. I watched myself re-enter the frame, approach the truck, and unlock the door. The time displayed for my return was clearly visible. My eyes narrowed. I replayed the segment. The camera showed me departing the truck at around 1:17 in the morning. Then, it showed me arriving back at the truck at approximately 1:11 in the morning. I paused the footage, staring at the numbers. This was not a simple error of a few seconds. The camera indicated I had returned 6 minutes before I had left. I replayed it again, several times, checking the precise frames. The times were consistent within the recording. My departure was logged at 1:17. My arrival was logged at 1:11. The internal clock of the dashcam, which had always been accurate, seemed to have shifted. I checked my phone, which showed the current time as just past 3 in the morning. The truck's internal clock also matched my phone. A new detail then emerged from the dashcam audio. During the period I was supposedly on the trail, the camera had recorded a distinct sound. It was the wail of a siren, faint at first, then growing louder as if passing on the nearby highway, before fading into the distance. It was a clear, unmistakable emergency vehicle siren. The sound was captured with surprising clarity given the distance. I listened to it several times, the hum of the forest momentarily replaced by that artificial cry. I looked out at the empty gap lot, the pole lights casting long, still shadows. The silence now felt heavier. I then noticed something else. The pole lights in the parking lot each had small illuminated clocks built into their bases, meant to display the current time for hikers. I had never paid them much attention before. Now, I looked closely. The clock on the nearest pole showed a time that was different from my phone. The clock on the pole across the lot showed yet another time, distinct from both my phone and the first pole. One read a little past 2 o'clock, the other closer to 2:30. My phone read just past 3. The dash cam, which had recorded my impossible return, now showed a time that was roughly synchronized with my phone. The discrepancy was not just with my dash cam footage, but also with the fixed infrastructure of the lot itself. The cold air seemed to press in closer. My initial reaction was a mix of confusion and a strange kind of disbelief. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the dashcam had a glitch, a momentary power fluctuation that reset its internal clock. But the footage itself was continuous, no breaks or jumps. The time discrepancy was a smooth, impossible reversal. I checked the camera's settings, but everything appeared normal. Its time synchronization was set to automatic, pulling data from GPS satellites. I pulled the memory card from the dash cam, intending to review the raw files on a larger screen. The next morning, back at my cabin, I transferred the video files to my computer. The larger display confirmed what I had seen in the truck. My departure was clearly marked at 1:17, my return at 1:11. The 6-minute reversal was undeniable. The siren audio was also clear, a distinct, rising and falling wail. I listened to it repeatedly, trying to identify any specific characteristics, but it was just a standard emergency siren. The sound seemed to originate from the direction of the highway, but it was not particularly close. My next step was to investigate the siren. I contacted local dispatch services, explaining the situation as calmly and factually as possible. I provided the approximate time the siren was recorded, which was around 2 o'clock in the morning according to my phone, but around 1:30 according to the dashcam's internal clock at the time of the recording. I asked if any emergency vehicles had been dispatched to the area of the gap lot, or if any had passed through on the highway during that window. The dispatcher checked their logbooks. After a few minutes, they reported no record of any emergency calls or units in that specific vicinity during the entire night. No fire, no ambulance, no police. Nothing. The siren had simply not been logged by any department. This lack of an official record deepened the unease. A phantom siren, recorded by my camera, but existing nowhere in official channels. It felt like a piece of the night had simply detached itself from reality. I then remembered the pole clocks. I decided to report the discrepancy to the Park Facilities Department. I explained that the clocks on the light poles in the gap lot were displaying different times, none of which matched standard network time. I filed a maintenance ticket, describing the issue as a general electrical or synchronization problem. A few days later, I received an update on the facilities ticket. A technician had visited the gap lot. The report confirmed my observation. The clocks on the pole lights were indeed out of sync with each other and with standard time. The technician noted that one clock was off by nearly an hour, another by about 40 minutes. The report offered no explanation for the discrepancy, only stating that the clocks had been reset and synchronized. There was no mention of a power surge, a malfunction, or any other cause. It was simply an unexplained issue, now resolved. The report was brief, procedural, and offered no comfort. The combination of the dashcam's impossible time reversal, the unlogged siren, and the inexplicably desynchronized pole clocks created a quiet dread. It was not a fear of a physical threat, but a deeper unease about the fabric of reality itself. The isolation of the forest, which I had always sought, now felt like a vulnerability. The familiar hum of my radio in the truck, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to carry a faint static, a whisper of something just beyond comprehension. No further explanation ever emerged. The dashcam footage remained, a silent piece of evidence showing an impossible event. The facilities report was filed away, a minor maintenance issue with an unstated cause. The dispatch logbooks remained empty of any siren activity. I never received any follow-up calls or inquiries. The incident was closed, officially unresolved, but effectively forgotten by the systems I had contacted. I continued my night runs, but I avoided that specific gap lot for a long time. The thought of those mismatched hours, the unlogged siren, and the camera's impossible recording lingered. It felt as though a small tear had appeared in the normal flow of time and events, a brief moment where the rules simply did not apply. The cold logic of the procedural reports offered no comfort against the quiet implications of what I had observed. The forest, once a place of predictable solitude, now held a different kind of mystery. Sometimes, when I am out on a trail at night, the silence feels different. I listen for distant traffic, but sometimes I hear something else. It is a sound that isn't there, a whisper of a siren fading into the deep forest. The memory of those mismatched hours, the impossible reversal, still comes back. It is a quiet reminder that some things simply do not fit, and no report can ever fully explain them. I was running a section of the Appalachian Trail, a routine night run I had done countless times. It was late autumn, and the air carried a sharp chill, barely above freezing. That night, a distinct metallic ring echoed from a closed campsite, a sound that should not have been there. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the dense forest. The trail was mostly gravel and packed earth, familiar underfoot even in the deep isolation of the night. I preferred these late hours for the solitude and the quiet challenge. The campsite, known as Blackwood Gap, was officially closed for the season. Its access road was gated, and all facilities were supposed to be secured. The ringing sound was not continuous. It came in precise, even intervals, like a slow, deliberate strike against metal. It was too regular to be an animal, too clear to be the wind. I slowed my pace, listening more intently. The sound seemed to originate from the area where the bear cables were installed, a system of pulleys and wires used by hikers to hoist food bags out of reach of wildlife. The cables were usually silent unless actively used. This was different. The cold air seemed to carry the sound directly to me, amplified by the stillness of the forest. I stopped completely, my breath pluming in the beam of my light. The ringing continued, a steady, almost rhythmic pulse in the deep night. It was an anomaly in a place I knew intimately, a place that should have been utterly silent. My routine involved covering about a dozen miles on these night runs. I carried minimal gear, a small pack, water, a first aid kit, and a handheld radio for emergencies. The radio was usually quiet, only used for check-ins with a friend who monitored my progress from home. The Appalachian Trail in this region was rugged, but I knew every turn and elevation change. The forest at night was usually a symphony of natural sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the subtle hum of insects. Human sounds were rare, especially after the official closing of the campsites. I had encountered deer, raccoons, and even a black bear on previous runs. But their movements were always organic, never mechanical. My purpose was simple: physical conditioning and mental clarity. The isolation of the trail after dark provided both. I had a deep respect for the wilderness and its inherent dangers. I always followed protocol, reporting any unusual activity to the local park rangers. This metallic ringing was certainly unusual. It broke the natural silence in a way that felt unnatural. The ringing persisted, drawing me closer despite my initial hesitation. I decided to investigate, knowing that an unsecured campsite could pose a hazard or attract unwanted attention. I left the main trail, following a faint game path that led toward the bear cable area. The ground crunched softly under my trail shoes. As I approached, the sound grew clearer. It was definitely coming from one of the bear cable pulleys. The system consisted of a thick metal cable strung between two tall trees, with a smaller pulley wheel that allowed a rope to be threaded through, raising and lowering a food bag. The sound was a distinct clink of metal on metal, as if the pulley was being struck. I moved slowly, my headlamp sweeping the area. The campsite was deserted, as expected. Tents were packed away, picnic tables overturned, and fire pits cold. The air was still and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth. The ringing continued, steady and unwavering, coming from the pulley assembly on the far side of the clearing. I reached the base of the tree where the pulley was mounted. The cable was taut, stretching high above. The ringing emanated directly from the pulley wheel itself. I could not see anything physically striking it. The rope was neatly coiled and tied off at the bottom, just as the rangers would have left it. There was no visible sign of tampering or animal activity. I stood there for a few minutes, observing. The ringing occurred every few seconds, a consistent rhythm. It was too precise to be random. I reached up and grasped the rope, pulling it gently. The ringing stopped instantly. The pulley was silent. I held the rope, then slowly released it. It remained still. The silence felt heavier than the ringing had. I waited, listening. The forest was quiet again, save for the faint whisper of the wind through the high branches. I took a few steps back, shining my light up at the pulley. Nothing moved. I decided it must have been some unusual resonance, perhaps a loose component vibrating in the cold air. It seemed unlikely, given the sound's regularity, but it was the only logical explanation. I turned to resume my run, taking about 20 steps back towards the game path. Then, the ringing started again. It was the exact same rhythm, the same metallic clink, coming from the same pulley. I froze. This was not resonance. I turned back, shining my light directly at the pulley. It was still high above, motionless. The rope was still neatly tied off. Nothing was touching it, yet the sound continued, unwavering. I felt a cold dread begin to settle over me. This was beyond any natural explanation. I pulled out my handheld audio meter, a small device I sometimes use to record ambient forest sounds for personal projects. I pointed it towards the pulley and activated the recording function. The meter registered the distinct metallic strike, but beneath that, almost imperceptible to the ear, was a faint, high-frequency hum. It was a subtle, almost electrical hiss, a sound I had never associated with the bear cables. The hiss was constant, a low-level static beneath the rhythmic clink. It was barely audible, but the meter clearly picked it up. This added another layer of strangeness. Bear cables were entirely mechanical. There was no electrical component anywhere near them. The nearest power lines were miles away along the highway. I stood there, recording the sounds for several minutes. The ringing and the underlying hiss continued without interruption. I felt a growing sense of unease. It was not fear of an animal or a person. It was the fear of something inexplicable, something that defied the known rules of the environment. I knew I needed to report this, and I felt a strong compulsion to document the anomaly. I continued recording for a few more minutes, capturing the rhythmic strikes and the subtle electrical hum. I then carefully approached the pulley again. This time, I did not touch the rope. I simply stood beneath it, listening. The sound was directly overhead. I could feel a faint vibration in the air, almost imperceptible, but present. It was a diffuse hum that resonated through the atmosphere. I decided to try a different approach. I walked to the other end of the bear cable system, where the cable was anchored to a second tree. I checked that anchor point. It was secure, the cable tight. There was no visible movement or source for the sound from that end. The sound was definitively coming from the pulley mechanism itself, high in the first tree. I took several photographs with my phone, capturing the pulley against the dark sky, illuminated by my headlamp. The pulley looked normal, unremarkable. It was standard equipment, but it was behaving in an unusual way. I considered climbing the tree to inspect the pulley directly, but the conditions were not safe. The tree was tall, the bark slick with frost, and I was alone in the deep night. It was not worth the risk. My priority was to gather information and then leave the area. I walked back to the first tree, the ringing continuing its steady rhythm. I tried to discern any pattern in the sound, any variation in its intensity or timing. There was none. It was perfectly consistent, a machine-like regularity that was deeply unsettling. The underlying hiss was also constant, a low, almost subliminal presence. I made the decision to silence it again. I reached up, grabbed the rope and pulled down firmly. The ringing stopped. The hiss, however, did not. It continued, a faint, high-pitched static that seemed to permeate the air around the pulley, even though the metallic strikes had ceased. This was a new development. The hiss was independent of the ringing. I held the rope for a longer period this time, perhaps a full minute. The hiss persisted. It was a subtle sound, easy to miss if not actively listening for it, but it was there. It felt like a low-level electrical charge in the air. I slowly released the rope, watching the pulley. It remained silent. The hiss continued for a few more seconds, then faded, leaving only the profound silence of the forest. I did not wait to see if the ringing would resume. I turned and moved quickly back towards the main trail, my mind racing. The rhythmic strike, the sudden cessation when touched, and the persistent electrical hiss pointed to something far more complex than a simple malfunction. It felt like an active, controlled event. I completed my run, though my focus was broken. The image of the silent pulley and the lingering hiss remained. As soon as I arrived home, I transferred the audio recording and photographs to my computer. The audio clearly showed the metallic clink and the distinct high-frequency hum beneath it. I filed a detailed report with the park rangers the following morning. I included the audio file and the photographs. The ranger on duty, Miller, listened patiently to my account. He seemed skeptical but took the report seriously, noting the unusual nature of the electrical hiss. He promised to send a team to investigate the closed campsite. A few days later, I received an update. Ranger Miller informed me that a team had visited Blackwood Gap. They found the bear cable pulley system intact and silent. There was no evidence of tampering, no unusual electrical readings, and no lingering sounds. The area was exactly as it should have been. They had no explanation for the sounds I reported. The incident was logged as an unexplained auditory phenomenon. I kept a copy of the report and the original audio file. The experience left a lasting impression. I continued my night runs, but I avoided Blackwood Gap. The isolation of the forest now carried a different weight. I sometimes wonder what caused that rhythmic ringing, what generated that faint, electrical hum in the deep Appalachian night. I still hear it sometimes, not with my ears, but in the quiet moments before sleep. It is a faint metallic clink, followed by a subtle hiss. The sound remains a reminder of an event that defied explanation. I was a night runner on the Appalachian Trail. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. That particular night, the trail felt subtly different beneath my feet. My routine involved long stretches after dark, often covering many miles between shelters. I carried minimal gear, relying on a headlamp, a small pack, and a handheld radio for emergencies. This section of the trail, a few miles past a well-known gap trailhead, included a creek crossing I had navigated countless times. It was usually a shallow ford, barely reaching my ankles, even after heavy rain. I always carried a small action camera mounted on my helmet, mostly to document wildlife or interesting trail features, but also as a record of my runs. The water was always icy, a shock to the system, even on warmer nights. As I approached the ford, the beam of my headlamp cut through a thin fog that had settled low over the water. The creek looked wider than usual, and the sound of the current seemed a little louder, a low hum against the quiet of the forest. I paused at the bank, pulling out a small, pre-cut measuring stick I sometimes used for quick depth checks. It was a habit born from curiosity, not necessity. I pushed the stick into the water near the usual crossing point. The water reached well past the mark I expected. This was the first clear sign something was amiss. My night runs were a solitary pursuit, a way to experience the trail in its most raw state. The isolation was part of the appeal. I knew these ridge saddles and reroutes intimately. I had a good sense of the terrain, the typical flow of the creeks, and the subtle changes in the forest. My equipment was always checked before each run. The radio was a basic model, but reliable for short-range communication with park rangers or other trail users in an emergency. I kept a logbook of my runs, noting conditions, wildlife sightings, and any unusual observations. This meticulous approach was standard practice for me. I believed in preparation and documentation. The cold, the dark, the quiet. These were my companions. I found a certain peace in the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the gravel path. I took out my action camera, ensuring it was recording. The fog was thick now, swirling around my knees, making the headlamp beam diffuse. I pushed the first measuring stick into the water. It sank until the water reached my mid-thigh. I filmed it for a few seconds, noting the depth. Then, I pulled it out and moved a few paces upstream, trying another spot. The second stick showed a similar depth, perhaps an inch or two less, but still far deeper than normal. I filmed this as well. I moved back to the original spot, pushed the stick in again, and the water was still at the same unusual level. The current felt stronger, pulling at the stick. The icy water was now a significant obstacle. I decided to check downstream. I walked along the bank for about 50 yards, looking for any obvious obstructions or changes in the creek bed. The water there seemed to flow at its usual, shallower depth. I could see the bottom clearly in the beam of my light. There was no logjam, no recent landslide, nothing that would explain the localized increase in water level upstream. It was as if a section of the creek had simply deepened without cause. The hum of the water was constant, a low, steady sound. I returned to the crossing point. The water still measured thigh deep. I considered turning back, but the shelter was only a few miles ahead, and I was committed to my route. I carefully waded into the creek, the cold biting at my legs. The current was surprisingly strong, making each step deliberate. I kept my balance, pushing through the water. The crossing took longer than usual. When I finally reached the far bank, I pulled myself out, shivering. My clothes were soaked from the waist down. As I stood on the far bank, catching my breath, my headlamp beam swept across the trail. That's when I saw them. Fresh mud prints, clear and distinct in the soft earth. They were human footprints, large and deep, as if someone had crossed the creek recently. But they were facing the wrong way. They were pointed into the trail, as if someone had walked from the forest across the trail and then into the creek, not from the creek onto the trail or along the trail. They were oriented perpendicular to the established path, leading directly from the dense forest edge, across the trail, and into the water. There were no corresponding prints on my side of the bank, nor any leading away from the creek on the far side. Just these few, deep impressions, facing the wrong direction, disappearing into the water. The sight made the hair on my arms stand up. The isolation of the forest pressed in around me. I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging in the cold air. The implications of the footprints were unsettling. I took out my camera again and filmed the prints, getting close-ups of their unusual orientation. I then scanned the forest edge where the prints seemed to originate. The trees were thick, a dense wall of shadows. There was no discernible path or break in the undergrowth. It was as if someone had simply materialized from the woods and walked directly into the creek. The cold from my wet clothes began to seep deeper, turning my initial unease into a more profound sense of dread. I tried my radio. I pulled it from my pack, extended the antenna, and pressed the transmit button. I called out to the nearest ranger station, giving my location and a brief description of what I had observed. All I received was static. I tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly, but the result was the same. A persistent, low hum of static filled the air. The radio was usually reliable in this area, though certain ridge saddles could sometimes cause interference. This felt different. It was a complete blackout, a dead zone. The lack of response amplified my isolation. I decided to proceed to the shelter, but with extreme caution. I kept my headlamp beam sweeping wider, constantly checking the forest around me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded amplified in the quiet night. The trail ahead felt different now. No longer a familiar path, but a corridor through something unknown. I moved faster than before, a sense of urgency driving my steps. I kept looking back at the creek crossing, half expecting to see something emerge from the fog. When I reached the shelter, about an hour later, it was empty. The logbook inside was also blank for the past few days, which was unusual for this time of year. I quickly changed into dry clothes, my hands still shaking slightly from the cold and the lingering unease. I tried the radio again from inside the shelter, hoping the slight elevation or different atmospheric conditions might help. Still, nothing but static. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, the wind whispering through the trees. I reviewed the footage from my helmet camera, watching the water level change, the strange footprints, the fog. The evidence was clear, but the explanation remained elusive. At first light, I packed my gear and hiked out, choosing a different, longer route that avoided the creek crossing. I reached a small town by late morning and immediately reported the incident to the local authorities. They took my statement and reviewed the camera footage. The park rangers were notified. They sent a team to investigate the creek crossing and the surrounding area. Their report, which I later received a copy of, confirmed the unusual depth of the creek at that specific ford. They found no natural explanation for the localized increase in water level. They also confirmed the presence of the strange footprints, noting their unusual orientation and the lack of corresponding tracks. The rangers speculated about a sudden, localized groundwater surge or a temporary shift in the creek bed, but admitted these were unlikely given the lack of other evidence. The radio blackout was attributed to atmospheric conditions, though I knew my radio had never failed like that before. The incident was filed as an unexplained hydrological anomaly with unidentified tracks. There was no further investigation. The file remains open but inactive. I stopped night running on the Appalachian Trail after that. The experience had fundamentally altered my perception of the familiar wilderness. I still review the footage sometimes, watching the water deepen, seeing those prints appear from nowhere. The cold of that creek, the hum of the static, the image of those footprints facing the wrong way. They are all vivid in my memory. I often wonder what or who made those tracks, and why they walked into the water like that. The quiet dread of that night has never truly left me. I worked the night shift, patrolling remote boundary roads. The air was cold, barely above freezing, even in late spring. I saw something unusual lying on the gravel ahead. My job involved monitoring access points into protected forest lands. I drove a marked vehicle, mostly alone, through the Appalachian foothills. The routes were often unpaved, winding through dense forest and along ridge saddles. My shifts typically began after sunset and ended before dawn. It was a solitary existence, punctuated by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. I knew these roads intimately, every dip and rise, every patch of loose gravel. This particular night, I was on the northern perimeter, a stretch of road that saw little traffic. The forest pressed in close on both sides, a wall of dark trees. My headlights cut through the deep night, illuminating only the immediate path. The isolation was profound, a constant companion. I had just passed the old fire watch cabin turnoff when the light caught something pale on the road surface. It was not debris I recognized. I slowed the vehicle, my tires crunching softly on the gravel. My routine was predictable, a rhythm of checks and reports. I would stop at various gates, ensure they were secured, and log my observations. The radio was my only consistent link to the outside world. though reception could be spotty in the deeper valleys. I carried a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and a small camera for documenting anything out of place. Most nights were uneventful, a quiet vigil against trespassers or illegal dumping. The cold was often the most challenging aspect, especially in the pre-dawn hours when the frost settled. I had grown accustomed to the silence, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. It was a job that required patience and a keen eye for detail. I often thought about the hikers on the nearby Appalachian Trail, sleeping in their shelters, oblivious to the patrols moving through the night. I brought the vehicle to a complete stop. The object on the road was a stack of paper, held together by a thin, dark band. It lay flat, as if it had been dropped or perhaps blown there. The edges of the pages were dry, but the surface was covered in a fine layer of tire dust. This dust was not uniform. It formed distinct patterns, like faint smudges across the paper. I stepped out into the cold night, the air sharp and still. My boots crunched on the gravel. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam steady on the pages. The stack consisted of about 3 sheets, folded over once. I knelt down, careful not to disturb the dust patterns. The paper felt like standard printer stock, slightly stiff. I could see faint lines and boxes printed on the pages. It looked like some kind of log or register. The dust was thickest in the center of each page, leaving clearer, rectangular spaces around the margins. These clearer spaces were where names or signatures would typically be found in a guest book. They were completely blank. I carefully picked up the stack. The thin band holding them together was a rubber band, old and brittle. It snapped as I lifted the papers. The pages separated in my hand. I held them under my flashlight. The top page had a header, Shelter Register. Below that there were columns for date, name, and comments. The name column was empty on all 3 pages. The comments section also contained no entries. The most striking detail was the date. On the first page, under the date column, a specific date was written in a clear, blocky hand. I checked the second page. The exact same date was written there. I turned to the third page. Again, the identical date appeared.